The Summer Games Minute, brought to you by Mass Mutual. Alice Coachman had a habit of proving her doubters wrong. Her father once told her to stop running outside and sit on the porch to, quote, be more ladylike. Luckily, Alice didn't listen to her father. Born in the segregated South in Georgia in the 1920s, Coachman kept on competing and became a dominant high jumper and runner. In the 1948 Summer Games in London, the first following World War II, Coachman won gold in the high jump, becoming the first Black American woman to win gold. 4 years later, she broke another barrier, appearing in Coca-Cola ads across the world with Jesse Owens, something no Black American woman had done before. Mass Mutual understands the nuances in how women want and need to manage their finances. With quality product solutions and guidance, a Mass Mutual financial professional can help you plan for both short-term and long-term money goals. Learn more and get started at massmutual.com.
As you've probably heard by now, we've teamed up with BetMGM this season. We'll be using BetMGM lines to make all of our picks, and we'll have special offers for our listeners each week. If you haven't signed up for BetMGM yet, use bonus code The Athletic, and you'll get a 1-year subscription to The Athletic, plus up to a $1,500 first bet offer on your first wager with BetMGM. Here's how it works. Download the BetMGM app and sign up using bonus code The Athletic. Make your first deposit of at least $10. Place your first bet on any game and claim your voucher for a 1-year subscription to The Athletic. See BetMGM.com for terms. U.S. promotional offers not available in D.C., Mississippi, New York, Nevada, Ontario, or Puerto Rico. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER. Available in the U.S. Call 877-8-HOPE-NY or text HOPE-NY 467-369 in New York. Call 1-800-NEXT-STEP in Arizona. 1-800-327-5050 in Massachusetts. 1-800-BETS-OFF in Iowa. 1-800-270-7117 for confidential help in Michigan. 1-800-981-0023 in Puerto Rico. First bet offer for new customers only in partnership with Kansas Crossing Casino and Hotel. Don't forget, if you haven't signed up for BetMGM yet, use bonus code The Athletic, and you'll get a 1-year subscription to The Athletic, plus up to a $1,500 first bet offer on your first wager.
Jewelry can say many things on your wedding day. As a wedding band, it can say, "This is a forever symbol of our forever love." As a gift to your wedding party, it can say, "Thanks for standing up there with us." Blue Nile can help you find the piece that says it all and says it beautifully, with expert guidance and a wide assortment of jewelry of the highest quality at the best price. Go to BlueNile.com and experience the convenience of shopping Blue Nile, the original online jeweler since 1999. That's BlueNile.com.
The Athletic.
The race is on, and Oscar Piastri bagged his first Grand Prix victory in Hungary, leading home teammate Lando Norris for a McLaren 1-2 as Max Verstappen managed only 5th. But was McLaren's day ruined by a team orders row, and was there even a row to speak of? I'm Edd Straw, and joining me to tell all are Mark Hughes, Scott Mitchell-Malm and Val Khorounzhiy. Scott, how was Hungary for you?
Yeah, it's been an interesting week. The on-track spectacle, I think, was helped by various elements of controversy and tension through the race, but it's always quite gripping now, although we still have a pretty comfortable Max Verstappen leading the championship. As we've said before, race-by-race narratives are just as important, if not more important sometimes, than a championship narrative, especially when the championship one feels a little forced. So we're going into every weekend, and this was another one where you think, okay, well, this is what I think the pecking order probably will be, and then actually doesn't quite play out that way. Even with a much vaunted Red Bull upgrade, it was actually relatively comfortable for McLaren in the end. So, yeah, fascinating. And to be honest, a new Grand Prix winner, that's always something to enjoy as an experience.
Yeah, absolutely so. How about you, Mark? Hungaroring's one of those tracks, sometimes people think it's dull, but it always throws up something interesting, doesn't it?
It does, yeah. For the last few years, it's been one of the strongest races of the season, probably for the last 10 years, actually. And because it's such a very stern test of tyre deg, it really the competitive order really revolves around who best resolves that. And it's clearly something of a pattern now that the McLaren is just better all round on its tyres and balancing the front and the rear of the car, and then that proved to be the really decisive factor in and making them the clearly the quickest car, despite the Red Bull's upgrade, which was targeted at improving that very that very quality that is needed. But it worked up to a point. I think Verstappen said it's definitely better than it would have been, but it just around a track where such importance is played on that balance, the McLaren advantage was probably the biggest it's been.
Yeah, certainly the most decisive we've seen. And Val, you were getting very enthusiastic during the race in terms of what you're seeing. You standing by that now the dust has settled?
Yeah, I mean, maybe went a bit far calling it like one of the best races I've ever seen. I think that's probably a bit too much, especially considering that in terms of on-track action, it wasn't very good. It was, it was the Hungarian, all right. But it was, if it's not one of the best races I've ever seen, it's one of the most Formula One races I've ever seen, if that makes any sense. There was something quintessentially F1 drama about this on both the Max Verstappen end of it, obviously with the squabbles with the race engineer Jean-Pierre Lambiase, but absolutely with the McLaren dilemma and how they tried so desperately to work their way through it, negotiate their way through it. You said, a row that maybe wasn't a row. I mean, it was absolutely a row, wasn't it? That much is obvious.
Well, we're going to get into the detail of that one in a moment. There may be some different views on it, but Mark, we'll apply the how the race was won question to McLaren specifically here, because it's fairly obvious how they won it, given they had the quickest car. But can you explain how the Piastri versus Norris battle played out and why team orders got involved at all?
Yeah, I mean, they were quite evenly matched on pace, and Oscar won it in the first corner, essentially. And the fact that you run in the turbulence of the car ahead pretty much defines if the two cars are equal. The car in front has the advantage, has a bigger advantage even than normal around here. And that allowed Oscar to build up quite a handy lead up to the first stops and beyond them. And by lap 33, we had it up to almost 4.5 seconds. And it looked to be it was going to be a comfortable routine 1-2 with Oscar ahead. But then he ran wide and clattered over the grass. And that error really sort of set into place all the controversy which was to follow, because that allowed Lando to get within a theoretical undercut striking range coming up to the second round of stops. And McLaren decided to play it very safe. They had Lewis Hamilton on a new set of tyres going quite fast, but not so fast that they needed to worry really, but they just decided just to play it safe. They would pit Lando first, just in order to just cut off any possible challenge from Hamilton on his new tyres, knowing that would invert the positions, but on the understanding that it was going to be changed back again after Oscar stopped, and Oscar was going to run a little bit longer just to cover off any possible tyre offset to Verstappen in the last stint. Again, it was a very distant threat and wasn't one that they really needed to concern themselves about. But they played it very safe and very conservatively, and ironically, that's what got them into trouble. And we then had the inverted position, and now Lando, as the car in front, had the advantage, and it pulled out a significant gap on Oscar, not just in those 2 laps of undercut, but even subsequently. Oscar sort of pushing quite hard in the first couple of laps, probably alarmed at how big a gap Lando had pulled out, but then seemed to relax, probably in the certainty that the positions were going to be inverted as he'd been promised. But of course, as you'll have heard, Lando was having second thoughts about it and really wrestling with his conscience. And eventually, he acceded to the team's wishes. So, as he pointed out, he really didn't deserve to have been put in the lead. It was the team that put him in the lead. And so he was arguing, well, why did you do that? That's not what I would have chosen to do. I'd caught him because he made a mistake, and I would have stayed out longer. And you've artificially put me in the lead, and now you're asking me to artificially give it back. So that was his reasoning. That was how he was trying to justify it. But I think in his heart of hearts, he knew that wouldn't really stand up to any scrutiny after the race. And he did the honourable thing.
Well, this is the big question, because Val, you were saying there absolutely was a row. Lando Norris says, I was always confident I was going to give the place back. So is it just all a storm in a teacup?
I mean, he might have been confident. I can't say what was going on in his head. Pretty obvious Will Joseph wasn't confident. You do not go on the radio and speak in that tone and say those words if you're confident. I mean, there was pleading. There was something that you describe as being borderline begging, I guess. There was appeals to Lando Norris's greater nature. There was, remember the team meeting, etc., do the right thing, all that sort of situation. And I'm sure, look, Lando Norris himself has admitted he was thinking about things and options and what he needs to do. And it's always, in Formula One, when it comes to observing team orders, it's always, it's game theory, isn't it? It's, can I afford to take today in pursuing my individual goals what then won't hurt me tomorrow? It's why, for instance, if you remember Lewis Hamilton's rejection of team orders in that one Abu Dhabi finale against Nico Rosberg, the one in which Rosberg won the championship, that was always very understandable to me, because that was showtime. That was the ultimate the ultimate prize. So at that point, individual versus team kind of goes out the window. Whereas here, this is a long-term partnership, a long-term team partnership between with Lando and Oscar that you could break today. It was completely breakable. The whole team could have turned on Lando. Oscar would have never trusted Lando ever again, basically, nor would he feel particularly kindly towards the team. There'd be a massive storm. Norris was never going to get away with disobeying team orders today, I think. But I might be wrong. But I think. And I think this is just the thought process that he had to go through in those laps while pumping in some really, really good, really fast lap times.
Yeah, after the race, I did ask him about this, because he said, I was always going to give the position back. And I said, well, it's clear from the messages we heard that the McLaren pit wall was not completely convinced of this. So why didn't you just give them some confirmation to put their minds at rest? He said, well, I didn't need to. And then he said, well, that's your opinion of what you hear, but it's the same with all sports. You can make what you will of what you hear and what you think you know, and that kind of stuff. Well, I would contend, Scott, that we did know that the pit wall was a bit worried, even if Norris absolutely was adamant of what he was going to do. There was something going on there. What did McLaren seem to make of it?
Yeah, team boss Andrea Stella said that he didn't have any doubt that Norris would move aside. He cited Norris as what he knows of Norris as a person as justification for that. But I think Val had it spot on when he mentioned the radio messages. The nature of those, the reiterance of those, they were pleading, and it wouldn't have been that public. It wouldn't have been that incessant if there was any doubt. Otherwise, it would have been one message, then it would have been a reminder a few laps later to just be like, just checking you're still going to do this.
Well, if there was no doubt, it would be absolutely insane, the conversations that were being had, because why would they be saying it?
Yeah, and also, you wouldn't have had Lando coming back to them with not messages of, I'm not going to do this, but messages of non-compliance. Yeah. Telling them, well, get Oscar to catch me then. Yeah. Or it might not matter to you, but it matters to me, about how they got into position and stuff like this. 100%. So I think what they've tried to do, and a big part of it is probably Norris feeling bad that he did it, is just they've tried to rationalise it after the fact and insist that actually everything was okay. But I don't think that was necessary, because I think if you just objectively view how each party handled this and what the conclusion was, it's actually played. I mean, it to my mind, it was dragged out a few laps too long, but otherwise it was absolutely fine. McLaren's plan to swap the cars is fine. Norris's reluctance to move aside is fine. McLaren's insistence that he does it and make sure that, I thought they handled that bit really well, just not letting it go. That was fine. And then Norris eventually doing it, but doing so reluctantly, also fine. So apart from the fact that I think it lent itself to tension, it created a story, as we're discussing it now, when there didn't need to be one. He could have just done it earlier. And the fact it probably would have been in Norris's interest to just swap places early, because then even if McLaren tried to say we hold position to the finish, if he was visibly loads faster than Piastri and could attack him, I don't think, and that had played out that way, and he defied a team order because he was so much faster, we'd be having a very different conversation now. But I think we'd be having one where we just said, well, he was clearly the faster driver and he overtook him cleanly. So, yeah, I get why McLaren's upset, but I think Norris did the right thing.
Exactly, and ultimately, as you ran through, there was nothing specifically wrong done. I think Norris was sort of making a little bit of a point at times as well, but maybe underestimated how big a deal it would become. I'm just going to run through a few quick fire questions from the Race Members Club on this to tackle some of the different dimensions. Mark, Robert, Odorcic says, did the squabbling on the radio embarrass McLaren a little?
Probably a little, but I think in the bigger picture, it's they would exchange it. If you said, do you want to have this problem, but your car's so up the front row and finish 1-2 in the race, but you've got a bit of embarrassment to manage along the way, they'd have snapped your arm off. So yeah, who cares really? It's I think would be the attitude, and it all turned out in the right way as far as the team is concerned in the end.
Question from Andrew Hire. Val, will Lando fighting back at team orders come back to bite him? Will Oscar Piastri be mad at this?
No, I don't think so. In fact, I think the way Lando is positioned right now, because this was so public and because he made it so obvious how much he didn't really want to do this, I'd argue there should be probably a feeling within McLaren, and to a lesser extent from Oscar because he is a professional racing driver, but within McLaren that they do kind of owe him one in a sense, even if that's not necessarily truthfully the case on the balance of the situation. But, today he held up his part. He did it very theatrically. He did it pretty late, but he put the team's interests ahead of his, own WDC interests. This was for Oscar's first win. I would not be surprised if this goes different for Oscar's second win or for Oscar's third win or what have you. Now, Andrea Stella today said that they don't plan to nominate a driver 1, driver 2 anytime soon, and that, they have a lineup where they don't have to do that unless it's like the final 2 races and there's one car in the championship and it's really close. I think after today, he has more of a freedom to do it. And I would, if I was in his place, I would be at least thinking about it in certain situations like today's.
I've said on social media already that I think what Norris gave up today, he'll get back and more between now and the end of the season. There's a lot of people who are saying that, in the interest of his slim championship hopes, he should be ruthless and take every point he gets. But if we're going to consider that McLaren is genuinely going to outperform Red Bull so much that Norris closes this massive gap to Verstappen and has a championship fight so close that 7 points makes the difference in Abu Dhabi, then I would contend there will be a lot more opportunities between now and the end of the season for Piastri to repay Norris the favour and for Norris to depend on good teamwork from Piastri and McLaren. If the title fight's going to get that close, then what he's done today will help him in the future to the tune of more than just 7 points.
Which is also the case McLaren was making to him on team radio, effectively.
And you wouldn't need to do that again if you were in complete control of the situation.
Question from Stuart Coulter, who says, I'm interested to know your views on whether Lando should have been ruthless and just taken the win McLaren's cack-handed pit strategy gave him on a plate. I doubt Verstappen and Vettel would have been as charitable in the same position. I'll take that one, and I will say I don't think he should. There is a time to be ruthless. There may be a time when it might be in his interest to do that, but this day was not today. And I was saying that during the race. A little part of me wondered if he did feel, because there have been questions about whether Norris is ruthless enough. He was asked about that on Thursday, and I did wonder if there was a thing in the back of his mind thinking it was a marker, but it wasn't the time to do it.
I would just say quickly on the cack-handed strategy point, the justification from it on McLaren's side was that yes, they had plenty of time in hand over Hamilton and Leclerc, but they didn't want to let too many more laps pass so that there was loads of pressure on the pit stop. So if they'd got just within undercut range with an extra lap or two of Norris staying out, and then basically that pit stop has to be perfect. And given they were in such control of the race, Stella's point was, I wanted that management to be on us, not on the pit crew to then deliver a crunch 2.3 second stop or something. Obviously you could argue that's what the pit crew's there for, but when you're in control of a race, you don't need to create stress for yourselves. You might argue also that they did that anyway by that situation, but if you buy Stella's logic that he was always confident Norris was going to invert the positions again, there was nothing to worry about.
I mean, even if he wasn't confident, that he made a probability play and it played out. They got the 43 points, so I don't see it as cack-handed. I completely understand what they did, and they bet on themselves to convince Lando to do it. Publicly, maybe not the best optics, but it worked.
And also, worst case scenario, they were going to have to deal with a grumpy Piastri, but they'd still have the 1-2 in the championship points.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Now, we've got loads of questions about this. I've only managed to pick out a few of them, unfortunately. We'll have to move on to our next topic now. But I think, it's worth just stressing it's a 1-2 for McLaren, and that was the absolute key for them. They delivered. They had the chance. They didn't throw anything away. So, Val, the team order debate must not overshadow a moment we've been anticipating for a long time. So how impressed were you with Piastri's breakthrough win?
Well, unfortunately, the team orders debate for me has overshadowed Oscar Piastri breakthrough win. I'm going to caveat this by saying Oscar Piastri has been super, super impressive in his time in Formula One so far. He's been an incredible signing for McLaren. He's going from strength to strength. There's clear development going on there. And the pace was already there to begin with. On the balance of his efforts in what has been a really good car, he has earned this. I have to admit that today, and I maybe I should watch the race again, because obviously Mark's assessment just now was that they were, looked fairly evenly matched. My impression throughout the race, and its impression conditioned by prior knowledge, was that the faster car was Norris, and that in the first and second stint he was constrained. And I mean, okay, Piastri was pulling out at the start of the second stint and at the start of the first stint, but then Piastri in doing so made a mistake, brought Norris close enough into dirty air where Norris stayed fairly comfortably for the remainder of that stint. And then when Norris had clean air, he vanished even with a tire offset. I think he was slightly annoying, because it's not that the best, fastest driver always has to win the race. And it's not that, always the best driver wins or whatever, and we talk about deserving. That doesn't matter so much. But I think Norris was faster today.
The point I would contend on Norris versus Piastri, especially in that final stint, is you had one driver who was adhering to the team request to bring in the tyres carefully and then look after them, and you had another driver who was very clearly not doing that, and who was just interested in proving a point, as Ed said, and was just going to build that gap as much as possible. That feels like that was what was going on to me. So, and then once you've done that and the dynamics of the stint are kind of set and they're different, that final stint becomes quite tricky to judge. I think Norris was the faster driver in the final stint, but you could easily argue that Piastri was managing the tyres in the first stint and still built a nice gap. He was very impressive there, but Stella kind of described it as the two drivers were balanced, and also suggested, a comparison to Piastri's performance here last year. Now, I think some damage did exacerbate Piastri's struggles relative to Norris, but he was nowhere compared to Norris this race 12 months ago. So I think it shows just how much he has come on that time management side.
I mean, we've talked about this on the way to the circuit one of the days, weren't we? Which is basically that this part of the game is, in my opinion, what comes on the latest, this stint management. It's what takes the longest to set in. It's what you can't really shortcut. It's experience. He's getting better. He's getting better all the time. And today he was obviously better than last year, and I think better than even at the start of the season. I think Norris still has more, and that's what makes this win a little complicated in my head. Look, I love it for Oscar. He deserves it. It's just, as an analyst, I put my analyst head on and I do this.
I'd say it could very easily have been without the undercut threat to Norris. They wanted to cover that Piastri led all the race, and you say, well, he was controlling it, etc. So it could have gone that way. Mark, what did you make of it? It's certainly significant for Piastri to get that one ticked off, isn't it? Because he's been hugely impressive. But do you think there was any glory taken off the win?
Only in the sense that there was a lot of attention on the other thing, So it was his historic first Grand Prix victory, and all the questions were being directed at Lando. So I suppose that, but he's not the sort of guy that would worry too much about that. He's very self-contained and very psychologically very even and airtight. And I don't think he will give any of that a second thought. So, no, I think he'd be very satisfied with the job he did. And he will be even more formidable going forward.
There was one other thing I wanted to mention on Piastri versus Norris, which I'll sort of make half the point, and then I'm going to sort of throw half a question to Mark as well, because I think he'll probably be better placed to answer than me. There was obviously, before everything kicked off, way before, right back to the start, the key moment was obviously Piastri grabbing the lead from Norris, and Norris is sort of like half chop on him and squeeze not against the pit wall, that's overstating it, but basically Piastri toughing it out, not being bullied by Norris, and then doing a really good job getting that move done under braking for turn one. As I said before, I feel like Piastri was the faster driver in the first stint in particular, just looked really comfortable and in control. But Mark, based on your read of the race, as you'll have looked into it a little bit more deeply than obviously the limited view I've had from out here, do you think that if Lando had the lead at the start, that he'd have been in complete cruise control in that race, or was Piastri genuinely quicker or as quick as him at times?
No, I think it was, any difference was within the noise. And the dominant thing was just the fact that you were invariably looking after your tyres more when you're the car behind. I don't think there was anything more than that to it, really. I think whichever way around you did it, it was always going to be the driver ahead was going to be able to pull away from the driver behind. And I think in that last stint, yes, you saw Lando pulling away faster than Piastri had pulled away in the first stint. But as you've already touched on, that was he was motivated to do that in a way that Piastri wasn't in the first stint.
I think it's worth noting as well at the start, I did think, considering it's his teammate and the threat of Verstappen, Norris may be moved across a little bit more than perhaps Andrea Stella would have liked, because that does limit your start and also limits Piastri's start a little bit by moving over. Norris had a poor second phase. But I think the great thing is this and the team orders thing, it just shows there's a battle to come between those two, which is going to be fantastic.
I do wonder, actually, on that point, if Norris has a little bit of not a start line weakness, but maybe a bit of a tendency to be a bit too jumpy at the start, because it wasn't quite as dramatic in terms of the visuals, but obviously in Spain he moved over and squeezed on Verstappen, didn't he? So maybe there is a little bit there where he feels a little bit vulnerable, and maybe he could do a slightly better job of managing that first and second phase to keep himself out of trouble.
Definitely something to work on for Norris, but doesn't take anything away from Piastri. Well done. We haven't spoken about Piastri almost enough, but we'll get back to him, I'm sure, in our midweek podcast.
You know we love talking stats here at The Athletic. Here's one that's super simple to remember. Discover automatically doubles the cash back you've earned on your credit card at the end of your first year with Cash Back Match. That means with Discover, you could turn $150 cash back to $300. That's right, you could put it towards some memorabilia you've had your eye on, or treat yourself to a premium sports network. You earn and Discover doubles. See terms at discover.com/creditcard.
We'll get back to the pod in a moment, but first of all, let me tell you about Grammarly. Email, Google Docs, Slack, you write across multiple platforms and places during your workday, so delivering consistent, high-quality communication everywhere is key. Grammarly is an AI writing partner that helps you get work done faster with high-quality writing for better projects, proposals, presentations, and more. Best of all, Grammarly works where you work, so you can get more done no matter what tools you use. As a journalist and podcast host, I'm constantly writing and rewriting copy and drawing up scripts. It's part of the job, and Grammarly helps make it faster. It's got some really cool features like tone suggestions to help you strike the right balance between direct and friendly in work emails. Plus, Grammarly has a ton of other great features like advanced spelling, grammar, punctuation, and conciseness suggestions to ensure your writing is professional, mistake-free, and clear. Get AI writing support that works where you work. Sign up and download for free at grammarly.com/podcast. That's GRAMMARLY.com/podcast. Easier said, done.
Jewelry can say many things on your wedding day. As a wedding band, it can say, "This is a forever symbol of our forever love." As a gift to your wedding party, it can say, "Thanks for standing up there with us." Blue Nile can help you find the piece that says it all and says it beautifully, with expert guidance and a wide assortment of jewelry of the highest quality at the best price. Go to BlueNile.com and experience the convenience of shopping Blue Nile, the original online jeweler since 1999. That's BlueNile.com.
Right, let's move on to the other big talking point, Scott. A simple question for you. Why was Max Verstappen so angry?
Simple answer: everything. He was irritated by the strategy. He was annoyed by some of his race engineer Gianpiero Lambiasi's sharp remarks back to him over the radio. Over the weekend as a whole, he was disappointed by the performance of the much upgraded Red Bull, and there's a sort of broader concern he has at the moment where he's suggesting that some people in the team aren't on the same wavelength as him. He's suggesting that they don't understand the severity of the situation in the way that he does, and if all of this sounds like quite a lot for a driver comfortably leading the World Championship, that's precisely the reason Verstappen's annoyed, because it's fine for sort of us to sit here and say, oh, he's going to wrap this championship up easily, that's fine, but Red Bull cannot have that mentality, and that's what it's becoming quite clear that Verstappen feels that is seeping in a little bit. He's not being listened to. They've not taken the threat seriously. They've not taken the limitations in the car seriously, and what he wants is everybody to meet what he considers to be his own sky-high standards. Whether or not he's taken that a bit too far, I suspect he probably is, but I think there is some validity to that sort of broader concern, because obviously in this race, yes, there were specific flashpoints, but it felt to me like it was indicative of a bigger picture.
Yeah, certainly he's concerned about the competitiveness of the car. They had that major upgrade, the bodywork change, which has improved matters a bit, but not by as much as he'd have hoped. I think there's two things with Verstappen. There's all the frustration you refer to there, all legitimate. I get why he's concerned, and we always talk about the need for people who are going to be champions need to not leave any points on the table and push for everything they can get. I was a bit concerned in the race that he wasn't really keeping himself focused on the immediate process in front of him. I thought the move on Hamilton was just needless on his part. It could very easily have led to him not scoring any points, and that's the thing that would work against holding on to that lead. And I just think that was pure impatience. It only cost him one place in the end. But when I saw him do that, I just thought, well, why have you done that? You're in a good position. Just accept this is a bad day. Maximise it, definitely, but don't do that.
Yeah, I mean, on replay, I had the same immediate reaction. On replay, kind of looking at it, I did sort of see where he was coming from in terms of the moving under braking stuff. Very nice. Very, very good. But yeah, but it also, we had that sort of, because that came right after a very touchy exchange with Gianpiero Lambiase. And I don't want to put, I don't want to sit here and armchair psychologist Max, but it certainly did look like he sort of felt an us against the world, but it's me against everyone. And there are figures in the rest of the team that don't really understand how problematic this race is turning out, how bad of a point hit we're about to take, how much we're being beaten this weekend, even with our upgraded car. And for me, we'll get into the move a bit, I think, right now. But for me, it was also... For me, the job of a race engineer, right, is it's a therapy session in a way when it comes to situations like these, but it's a one-way therapy session. You do not argue with your driver that, that somebody did something bad to him. You can tell him that after the race. I mean, that was not the time, was it, to debate whether he was in the right or wrong against Lewis, whether he was in the right or wrong against other stuff, whether he's talking too much about the car. I know he's being broadcast. I know you don't want people in the factory to hear it en masse. Not when he's in the cockpit, not in a race like that, not when there's another 20 laps to go. I
think the problem is that with someone like Verstappen, when he's so vocal, and as Ed was saying, I think he was losing sight and focus on what he should have been doing. I think he got into a bit of a spiral that's unusual for him today. I did feel like he went a bit too far with it, and sometimes Lambiase is the only person, I think, within the Red Bull organisation that can talk to him the way that he does, because obviously Verstappen can't do anything about it. If Lambiase wants to get on the radio and say it, he can. And I felt like there was a little bit of putting him back in his box and sort of basically calling him on his bullshit sometimes in this race. And a couple of and that example after the Hamilton incident in terms of being ahead at the apex, he was basically having none of it. He was just like, we don't think you're ahead at the apex, and then very, very sharply said that they didn't want to be drawn into doing what other drivers were doing, complaining over the radio. It's just childish. And I don't think he was saying explicitly, Max, you're being childish. It was, that whole thing is childish. Let's not entertain it. And it was basically quite a stern, look, this race has been ridiculous. Stop it. You're talking too much. You're losing control. Just get your head down and get on with it. And sometimes I think someone like Max needs that.
He does, yeah. And the bottom line is he finished fifth in a race. He should have finished fourth in, and could have finished third if the strategy had been right. So, that there were reasons for him to be frustrated, but he didn't deliver his best. So, yeah, it did overflow. Mark, did you think that relationship between Max and GP, we've talked about how good that is before, did it just expose how much friction there is in that team now?
Oh, yeah, for sure. And I also wonder if Jos is going to make use of that. And Jos has made no secret that he'd like to see Max out of there in the Mercedes next year, and Max has always said, no, that's not going to happen. I'm going to stay where I am. But he's got something to work with now, and it may turn out to be more significant than just an ill-tempered display from Max. Max can be furious when things have not gone right, and when things are below the standard they should be. And probably the last time he was as angry as this was in Singapore that time when they hadn't put enough fuel in, so he wasn't able to do the lap when the track was at its driest. And it's absolute. Just he will not accept any reasoning, any excuse is just absolute fury. And that's, he can control that and use it as a driving force when things are calm. But it's within him all the time, and it's just you see it exposed when things don't go well.
There's a question from Francis Cheer I'll throw in here, asking for our views on the lap 1 turn 1 incident where Max had to go off. He had nowhere to go and essentially avoided contact. Plus, he was ahead of Lando. Why would he have to give that back? I don't understand why Red Bull didn't have his back on that one. What do you think, Val?
Yes, I mean, so much has happened since. It almost feels like an entirely different race and an entirely different world. I don't know. In my book, it was an overtake completed around the outside. I mean, it's not that he took to going off the track. I have to see the telemetry, I guess, but it did feel like he stepped on it in the runoff. Made use of his track being wider than other people's track, which is what you do not want to do when people are fighting for. You do not want to have when people are fighting for position. You do not want to allow that. You do not want drivers to feel like they just need to look for an excuse to then gas it in the runoff and win at turn 1. I think you need to police that strictly. Yeah,
that's absolutely right. And I think also he anticipated being forced off. But when you look at it and you slow it down, he's not forced off. He anticipates being forced off and turns left just in case he was going to be forced off. And at the moment that he's on the track, that position is still being fought over. But the moment he leaves the track and is able to take that easier line, then obviously he's much faster. So of course he completed the he completed the overtake off the track, and that's not a legitimate move.
Yeah, and the reason Red Bull didn't try and fight his corner on that is it would have probably led to a 10-second penalty, which would not have helped his race. So it was the pragmatic thing to do, I would argue, in that situation. So I don't think they let him down there. I just think it was, as we've talked about, unless you want to object, Scott, to our reasoning on any of that.
Nope, I think that's a pretty good... I'll say summary, but that makes it sound like I don't think you guys went into much detail on it. But I think that's sort of all bases covered.
Sergio Perez, of course, came through to 7th after starting down in 16th place. We'll come back to him later in the question section in a bit more detail, but a reasonable salvage job after a pretty disappointing, to say the least, Saturday for him. Let's get on to Ferrari now, Mark. They had a floor tweak to try and solve the bouncing problems they've had. Charles Leclerc finished 4th, Carlos Sainz 6th. Is that job done then?
We don't know yet, because it's not a circuit with the sort of corners that would really expose the problem anyway. It's more your Silverstones and Barcelonas and things like that where you're going to find that. They feel that it's going to be better controlled with a slightly revised geometry, but they were still 2 or 3 tenths off. It wasn't a night and day difference, was it? So. Let's see. I don't think we know yet.
Yeah, and certainly Carlos Sainz said he wasn't convinced they'd made a big step. But Charles Leclerc, after the race, when I asked him, did say he thinks they understand the direction they're going. There's going to be a corrective package, a proper one, probably sometime after the break, I'd have thought.
Yeah, and Ed, that actually, I mean, you say after the race, but that was fairly consistent through the weekend, and that just seems more of a general tone thing right now between Carlos and Charles. Charles seems to be pretty convinced by the developments going on and by the general trajectory. Carlos more of a skeptic, I guess.
And could this correlate with one of them going and one of them staying?
Impossible. No, I don't think so.
Exactly. Yeah, there's still lots of work to be done for Ferrari. They were really 4th best. Obviously, they were helped out by Perez being down the order, and of course George Russell as well after the mess up in Q1. Partly his fault, partly the team's fault in terms of fueling and strategy. Some miscommunication. He came through to 8th, so actually he had a little mini race with Perez from down the order that Perez won. Scott, Yuki Tsunoda was 9th. He had that big crash in qualifying on a weekend where Haas could have beaten them to points, but didn't, and Aston Martin could also have beaten them. So how mixed up was that battle for best of the rest behind the top 4 teams?
Yeah, very mixed up. There was obviously an opportunity to steal in there and get into those last places. I think Aston Martin will be very disappointed with the return in the end. They were, I think, what's the best way of putting it? Probably misleadingly optimistic about what was possible after qualifying, when I just feel like their grid positions didn't quite reflect reality. Obviously, Perez and Russell weren't in the picture, and we know that their bigger problem has been race pace anyway, and didn't see that. I don't know. They were sort of cautiously optimistic about upgrades, but didn't really feel like it changed a great deal. And so the actual execution of the race kind of fell on whether or not you were among the early stoppers or you tried to extend early on. So that immediately cut out, I think, Daniel Ricciardo's, for example, battery. He was kind of in the mix early on, but then immediately on a bit of a hiding to nothing after the early stop. Whereas for Yuki Tsunoda, for example, RB played that really well. They split those two. That worked nicely. Tsunoda went long and then was able to basically rejoin, having lost very little ground, and then was also several laps to the good. Others sort of fell in and out of that fight. So for initially, after a really good start, Alex Albon looked like he was in it for Williams. The Hasses, as you mentioned, Ed, looked like they might be in it, but just the way that race ebbed and flowed meant that various people kind of fell out of contention, whereas Tsunoda was the only one who kind of just stayed there throughout, and obviously Stroll too.
Yeah, it's always one of those races. The undercut's so powerful. You always get an undercut cascade early on. Although it was interesting that you had, I think, 8 cars in total made those early stops, and then there was a bit of a gap before Stroll did it. But yeah, it was an untidy part of the race across the board. But Tsunoda did a decent job recovering from that crash.
I asked Ricciardo whether he understood the potential position of splitting strategies in that case, basically having one car do one thing, the other car do the other. He wasn't really in that camp that he kind of got where I'm coming from, but I think the problem is it did look like that classic almost Monaco-ish thing of you pitted later than the real proper undercutters, and then you got yourself stuck at a track where you can't really overtake behind a Haas that's monstrous in a straight line. Because it was Hülkenberg, I think, who was limiting the pace of that group for most of the stint. But then they also came up on Gasly's Alpine before Gasly's Alpine conked out, which is something it does a lot now.
Yeah, and Hülkenberg was the first to go because he had a terrible start, dropped to 14th, then he went to the hards quickly, made up some ground, and then you start to get that undercut. I think Ricciardo was maybe lap 7, and basically anyone who started on softs, it didn't work out very well for them. Aston Martin were the only ones who had no choice but to start on softs because they only had one set of mediums and one set of hards. But Aston Martin, Val, probably disappointed with just 1 point for Lance Stroll and Fernando Alonso in 11th. What evidence is there of progress with their upgrades, do you think?
It's difficult to say. I think they're going to have to take a really close look at it because, there's so much of this weekend, obviously, the race was conditioned by strategy. It's the Hungaroring, so you're going to get that in the midfield. But also, just the variable conditions seem to align almost too neatly with Aston's expectations and understanding of their own weaknesses and strengths. In the heat on Friday, they weren't very good. In the heat on Sunday, they weren't very good. In the cooler Saturday qualifying, they were pretty decent. I mean, as Scott says, not as decent as their grid position suggests, but pretty decent. And I think Lance Stroll, for all of his fairly short answers, I think did remain sort of the voice of reason through the weekend, just pointing out, hey, this is the track came to us, the track went away with us. They sound like they do think they made a step, and it's when we talk step, obviously it's the step needs to be relative, and that I don't think that's what they suggested. I think they just made a lap time step when everybody else also made a lap time step. They'll have to take a closer look, and also Spa will test their bouncing limitation a lot more than this place did.
Yes, very much so. I think it could be a little bit trickier there, but they're at least content they've made some progress with their problems, but not transformative, I would say, as yet. Right, it's that time again where we take questions from the Race Members Club. Thanks to all who have sent one in, and sorry to all of those we can't fit in. But the current plan is to tackle a bunch more for our midweek episode as well. If you'd like to contribute to the cavalcade of questions in the future, as well as getting all the other benefits, including bonus members, exclusive podcasts and early access to Bring Back V10s, check out the episode description for an idea of what you get from the podcast. I recently had a fascinating chat with ex-F1 driver and regular steward Derek Warwick to mark the publication of his outstanding book, Never Look Back, The Racing Life of Britain's Double World Champion, which I'd thoroughly recommend. We recently released that to members, and of course you can join through Patreon now as well. So let's crack on with our questions. Mark, Deck Clancy asks, I know Max didn't get 100% out of his car in qualifying, but do you think the amount of upgrades on his car this weekend was too much at once? More a knee-jerk reaction? Will Red Bull be able to definitively discern after the race how effective or ineffective each new part was, given the mass change?
No, I definitely wouldn't say it's a knee-jerk reaction, Deck. You're looking at a sort of a project probably a couple of months at least, so that will have been initiated. So a couple of months ago, and yes, they hurried to get it on the car for here, because it was felt that this would be the layout of the Hungaroring would be a very good test of the problem that we're trying to solve with this upgrade. And it's not so much. Yes, there were lots of new parts, but it was one upgrade. Each of those parts was part of the same upgrade. And if you'd left the old parts on, the old wing and the old, they're all minor parts. They were like brake ducts and the angle of the sheaths or the front suspension, things like that. They're just minor parts that are just there to fine tune the big change, which is the bodywork and the floor change. So it is one upgrade. Even though it includes lots of parts. So no, I think this is a very specific attempt and a very ingenious attempt to get themselves out of a cul-de-sac that all the teams to an extent are finding with these cars as they run them ever lower to get more downforce, and that's that there is a very different balance at low speed than there is at high speed, and so this was an attempt to give the car more rear end aero and allow them to crank more front downforce on, which would help in the slow speed corners and not upset it at high speed corners. And it did seem to be working on Friday with the very low grip surface, but as soon as the surface began to grip up and the temperatures came down, so we found that the problem was still there. Max says it's not as bad as it would have been if they'd had the standard car, if he was driving the standard car, but it still wasn't enough. It was in the right direction, but not enough. And so basically, as the grip comes up and the car is getting forced down on the suspension harder, so you get the problem where the front wing is running closer to the ground and getting into ground effect at high speed, and that gives the instability at the rear. And so it didn't. Several times through the weekend, you heard Max say when he was asked about the balance, he said, I want more front end through sector 2. He said, I've got understeer through there. He said, but I just haven't got enough grip in the fast parts to be able to do that. And so that in essence is the root of the problem. And it's not just Red Bull that's got it; they've all got it to an extent. And this was a way of getting out of that. And I think probably as the season goes on, we'll probably see it being developed to be much more effective than we saw this weekend.
And of course, it's worth noting, Pierre Vacher, the technical director, has said it's a possibility they'll switch between the specs depending on the downforce demands of the track. So they could have the regular package back at Spa. And of course, Perez didn't have the new bodywork. He had some of the upgrade, but not the main part of the bodywork. In particular, he had the front wing because obviously they didn't have enough parts ultimately, given how much they pushed to get this one turned round. Scott, a question from Samuel Bedford. With the petulance heard over the radio in this race, do you think more needs to be done to control what drivers do before the race, as David Croft said about several times? Or do you just think this is a sign of a hard-fought campaign for Max and a more determined Lando?
I'd be surprised if that had anything to do with what drivers were doing before races or anything like that. And I also think But I don't think there's anything. I think what you're getting in terms of the whingy driver radio messages, which has definitely become worse in recent years, that's a symptom of another problem, which is that everyone has to bloody grass on each other now. And it's just basically a massive game to make sure that race control hears everything and that the stewards look into everything. Because while I accept that there need to be, a decent foundation set of rules so that we all understand sort of what's being governed and why, I hate that it has just become this kind of playground snitching thing where it's all about making sure that you've been heard and that the teacher will come and have and tell off the person that you feel has wronged you. I think Lambiase put it correctly. It's childish. It reduces something so technical and high speed and high stakes and tense into something that just sounds quite petty and pathetic at its worst. And I don't think you get away from that unless you move away from a system whereby things can basically be reported to race control. And I don't think you can do that unless you have a system where everyone basically trusts each other and accepts basically the really foundational rule of racing in any kind of sport and any kind of human behaviour, which is, can everyone just try not to be dicks from time to time? And then maybe actually we could have all of this without drivers feeling the need to say, oh, he ran me off, oh, I was ahead at the apex, or this or that or the other. It's just unnecessary.
I kind of like the grassing and the snitching.
I think also getting rid of coded penalties would go a long way towards that. So you just have, as I've said many times, you don't have specific penalties for specific offences, which words can never encapsulate. If you just have a referee who decides yes or no, that would cut a lot of that out.
I kind of like the grassing and snitching, and it's because it's for the exact same reason that Scott mentioned, that sort of devalues it. It takes away from this high tech, elite, super tense sport. It makes these guys seem human and tells me stuff about these guys under pressure. It tells me about, in terms of the snitching, it tells me about how much they want to win and how much they're paying attention and what they see as acceptable in terms of looking that way on the radio. And in terms of Max's arguments, again, it is human drama in a way. I get the argument that it is a bit unseemly sometimes, but weirdly it's just never bothered me even a little bit. I wonder if I'm massively in a minority there, but
I think also it was exacerbated in this race because you had the team orders thing going on with Norris, and because Verstappen had various gripes as well. You had a couple of drivers who seemed in a particularly bad mood or a particularly truculent mood or whatever. But also they're under pressure, the heartbeat's high, they're competing. They're allowed to be a little bit irritated over the radio.
I would say being emotive over the radio is absolutely something that shouldn't be curbed or should be judged or anything like that. That's absolutely fine, but it's that specific way of it becoming that kind of bleating element. That's the bit that I don't like.
Val, J. Manon asks, is Red Bull's position in the Constructors' Championship properly under threat now?
He's been properly under threat before this race. It depends on I'm awful. It depends on the definition of the word properly. I can't believe I'm saying these words, but yeah, it is under threat. But also, I think 51 points is more than it feels, even if 44 points is the maximum for one race. But it's still, we don't really see that big constructor swings, I guess. And Red Bull, for all of Max's concern, rightful concern over it's slipping back against McLaren and being beaten up by McLaren in this race, it's still pretty damn good car, isn't it? And there's gonna be tracks where it's a much better car than this in relative terms. It is more under threat. They lost a lot of points today because of Perez's Saturday and Max's Sunday, but there's a lot of races to go. It's under threat. I don't know if I'd use the word properly necessarily, but maybe if I was a Red Bull right now, Max would be very unhappy with how I'm not on the same wavelength.
Okay, the next question from Scott Prost that I'll take. Do you believe, looking back, that Oscar Piastri would have rather let Lando win today's race and miss out on his first Grand Prix win rather than win it on team orders, especially given that with McLaren's form, he will likely win a race this season? There's no way Oscar Piastri would have rather let Lando win the race. I think he'd also contend he didn't win it on team orders because he was ahead and it was just that second pit stop undercut. So yeah, I think it's no on all counts ultimately. This wasn't a race won on team orders. It was a win that was maybe made complicated by team orders. It didn't necessarily need to be there. Mark, a question from Ben Gary. How good was Lewis Hamilton's drive? It seemed pretty flawless, but the pace of the car never looked like seriously challenging the McLarens.
No, the car wasn't on McLaren pace. Probably wasn't even on Red Bull pace, but he drove a better race than Verstappen because he was calm. Basically, he did all the right things. He several times had to get wheel to wheel with Max and always put his car in the right place. Didn't let any sort of emotion come into it. Just put his car in the right place, and it was a very, very tidy drive. But there was no way that you can really gauge the raw pace of drivers on the race at the Hungaroring. It's just you're driving purely to the rear tyre temperatures, and you're driving probably 2 or even 3 seconds slower than you could go if you just said to hell with the tyres. So it's a very delicate place for the rear tyres, and he did a good job on that. And it was absolutely flawless performance. But there's the difference between that sort of performance and the sort of performance we're looking to see if Lewis still has in him, the sort that he delivered at Silverstone.
Scott, a question from Connor Williams, who said Sauber, especially Bottas, looked very strong after qualifying. It seems like the updates are working well for them. Now, that question came in before the race, and obviously it didn't get converted into points. That's 13 pointless races. So Sauber and Bottas, where were they at?
Yeah, tricky. They kind of were on the fringes of the points fight all weekend, really. They never looked like being a proper Q3 contender. But the upgraded car that Bottas had did show more potential on Saturday than it had on Sunday. Than it had on Friday. Then they were in a reasonable position to kind of snipe for a point, but never established themselves strongly enough in that position. And as I sort of mentioned earlier, there were a lot of drivers that sort of floated away from the points as that race progressed, and Bottas was definitely one of them. I think really it just reflects the fact that this is the car that, am I right in saying it, on average has slipped to being the slowest over the course of the season. So a big upgrade could be worth several tenths of a second, but that isn't going to turn the 10th best car in F1 into the 5th best car. So it's not going to be scoring points on merit straight away, I don't think. I think this was a circuit that was slightly better for it, but I think positivity that it was, Bottas should have been and was in Q2, and they were fighting teams that they haven't been able to fight with in recent races. So if the race hadn't been quite as sort of split strategically as it turned out, maybe there would have actually been a bit more optimism for it. But I think Spa will tell us a lot more about this upgraded Sauber.
Val, a question from Barry O'Loughlin, who says, what on earth is that drone camera angle? It makes the cars look slow and makes me feel sick.
Yeah, it also makes me feel sick, to be honest. I've felt that multiple times during the weekend. First of all, I want to say that the gyro cam on the onboard thing on the Norris's qualifying laps, that's amazing. It's beautiful. So good to watch. So that's one sweetener. I don't think it added too much, the drone camera, but I think in terms of making the cars look slow, it's more what it does is it also helps you understand like the landscape and the sheer size of what's going on. That does maybe make the cars look slow, but I think when you don't go to a track, which I don't actually do so often, you don't really understand how large these spaces are. Because TV makes everything look pretty small, right? And having something move at such a pace, try to follow the cars around the landscape, I do actually see the attraction to that. The problem is it did make me nauseous quite a bit, yeah. Those
corners are probably a sequence on the calendar that's the worst for it, with those sort of like long radius 180-degree corners, the way that they sort of like come back on themselves as well. So there's kind of like a bit of a sort of slight almost spinning effect, isn't there? It's quite dizzying.
I'm thinking about it right now, and I kind of want to hurl.
Certainly made an impression on you. It's good they're using drones, but yeah, they have to be used in a good way. And it's early days for being able to use this sort of thing for F1 coverage. So let's see where they go with it. Alex Hindley, a question that I'll take. Why did the stewards call Max and Lewis after the race? They had plenty of time to decide before the end. Well, it's because they didn't. They still, a couple of laps from the end, hadn't made a final decision. They thought, well, we might as well hear from the drivers now. So maybe if it had happened a little bit earlier, the collision, they'd have had time to do it and work through it, and they wouldn't have needed to hear the drivers. But they didn't want to rush it, so it was done. Number one priority is the stewards need to go through the process and do it right. So it was, there was a limited amount of time, and then it just got to the point where it was sensible to hear from the drivers.
Do you think it would have been different if it was for the win?
Possibly, or it may have even taken even longer. Perhaps you just don't. Yeah. You just don't know. You try to be generous to the stewards because, as a bunch, they tend to try and do things the right way. I know some people will disagree with that, but it's a bit. I know where you're coming from, but it's always a bit dangerous to come up with a hypothetical that you can't test. It's sort of, what would they have done in a different scenario? But it's something worth always keeping an eye on. Mark, a question from Thomas Knights. With Charles Leclerc doing a long first stint, was stopping early for the second stop a poor move? It seemed to undermine the tyre advantage he had managed to create. Yeah, well, as always, Thomas, you're balancing the ideal strategy in terms of how you're balancing the tyre life with track position. And at the time, they were
stuck behind Max, and so they went for the undercut on Max. But unfortunately, it didn't really work. Hamilton came in at the same time, and they were then behind Hamilton. And even though they were on mediums, which were initially faster than Hamilton's hards, they actually over a stint there was no difference between the tyres. It was solely determined by how hard you pushed them. How hard you could push them, and you had to drive to the temperatures. So no, I mean they were trying to get out of a stalemate, and not necessarily compromise the stint length that they then had to do, and it didn't really work for them.
Scott, a question from Jason Phillips. If Daniel Ricciardo performs, does it make sense to promote him to RB? Does it make sense to promote him to Red Bull? Lawson's a V-carb and have a straight fight the next 6 months for the 2025 seat. And that's exactly why RB is a terrible, terrible team name, because it causes confusion.
Yeah, exactly.
So I feel vindicated by that. But yeah, you've been chasing what the latest situation is with this, so you're the ideal person to answer.
Yeah, it's been very fluid since Red Bull decided that it does need to work out contingency plans on Perez, given his form, and whether he needs to be replaced in the summer break. For a few weeks, we even reported this a few days ago, we felt that Liam Lawson was in prime position there because he's partly because neither Ricciardo nor Yuki Tsunoda seem to be really in Red Bull's thoughts. Ricciardo's not been impressive enough. Tsunoda just doesn't seem as he's off-track stuff as much as on-track stuff that seemed to put him off Red Bull and Christian Horner. And Lawson then did a test in the 2024 Red Bull the other day at Silverstone, which seemed to go well enough for Red Bull to be like, okay, we reckon that he's got enough about him that he'd be able to adapt to the car quickly and score the points that Perez is missing. But on further reflection, this has changed even over the course of this weekend. And if they feel they need to go that way, Ricciardo is now considered exactly as outlined in the question, the dependable, safe pair of hands, the driver with enough experience, enough adaptability, enough familiarity working with Verstappen that he'll be able to get in and then get the results that Red Bull need. So that's kind of the thinking there. And in doing so, obviously this situation would then have a seat at RB open up, which Lawson would take, and he would then have a full half season, if that makes sense, because he only did 5 races last year. That would give them lots more data on him, and Lawson would very much be a 25 candidate for Red Bull Racing, depending on the job he did at RB and whether Ricciardo excelled or not at Red Bull Racing. So yeah, I think in that question we've kind of outlined exactly where Red Bull's sort of logic is if they go down that route.
Good summary of a complicated situation. Val, on a related note, was Perez's comeback drive enough to keep him in that seat?
I mean, if it does go down to that sort of thing, it's just really stinky process, isn't it? to judge on something like that. I will say I thought it was a really good drive. I thought his pace and clean air was pretty good. I think apart from that early mistake at turn 2 that we clocked on the onboard fighting Russell, he seemed to do everything just about right. You know, he bid his time in the first stint. Then when he was released to undercut Russell, he did that very effectively while fighting through the traffic. He cleared Tsunoda well, I believe. He had the pace when he needed to have the pace. Looking at him in clean air compared to Verstappen, it seemed pretty good for him. And there were, I think, suggestions during the weekend that the upgrade has helped him in optimal conditions, and I think there were also, on Friday looked good, but you can't judge on that, can you? And it would be a very strange case of recency bias if that swung their opinion one way or the other, I think.
And the final question, also on a related topic, Christopher Partridge says, following Perez's crash in quali, has that now sealed his fate at Red Bull? And do you think that Red Bull Racing will announce this ahead of Spa in order to give him a final race acknowledgement? And I don't think it's sealed his fate, kind of the reverse of what Val said. That one incident it certainly hasn't helped his cause, but he did have a weekend where he felt a little bit more happy with the car. The front wing seemed to help him. Bit more consistency, best Friday of the season. So there are a few little green shoots for him to cling on to. It will not be announced ahead of Spa. As far as I understand, it won't be decided until the August break, as Scott alluded to. So they won't give him a final race acknowledgement. So this is going to roll over into the August break. Well, thanks very much for the questions. Sorry we've not been able to get through all of them. Thanks to Val, Scott and Mark for everything you had to say. It's a back-to-back, so we're going to be turning our attention very soon to the next race. So stay with us for everything you need to know from the world of Formula One.
The Athletic.